Good morning, everyone. We're just going to wait another 30 seconds, 45 seconds till everyone joins. But good morning. Right, good morning, everybody. As you all have seen, this morning's session is recorded, which we're doing such that we could show it to others as necessary later. My name's Jez Rutter from JRP Solutions, and I have two colleagues with me. Hilary Wood, who's director at EEVS, and Lev, who's a partner at Weightmans, and they'll introduce themselves shortly. So JRP Energy and Sustainability and outsourcing advice specialists. I'd like to just introduce the agenda for the day. As you'll see, I won't read to the slides, but in essence, we'll be going through the process from beginning to end and picking up different sections between Lev, Hilary, and myself. And we'll be wrapping up with a summary at the end. It's probably going to be fast and pacey. If you do have any questions, please do send them in through the chat, and we'll monitor that. And at the end, we'll try to, if there is time, have time for questions. And if there's any particular issues that come up that perhaps need answering straight away, we'll look at that as well. So first and foremost, I'd like to introduce Hilary, who's going to do part one.
Great. Yeah, thanks very much, Jez. Yeah, I'm Hilary from EEVS Insight. We're sort of specialists in measurement and verification and performance assurance for energy performance contracts. So I thought it'd be just useful to look at the start, sort of defining energy performance contracting. This definition is taken from the EU Energy Efficiency Directive. But I suppose the key things are that energy efficiency improvement measures, i.e. those things saving cost and carbon, are identified. So that's usually physical equipment combined with, say, ongoing operations and maintenance, controls, perhaps optimization, etc. The performance is measured, and the remuneration for the project is in some way linked to the performance achieved over a long term. So some sort of savings guarantee or a share of savings. And then if we move on to the next slide, in terms of sort of thoughts on why to use an energy performance contract. So firstly, viability. It may be that individual projects don't meet internal capital payback expectations, and an EPC enables a more holistic approach. Secondly, capital may be an issue, and an EPC could be a way of getting external finance. Risk, so in terms of enabling an organisation to transfer technical delivery and commercial risk by outsourcing that to an EPC provider, and to achieve savings, of course, which should outweigh any payments for the services. But then expertise, sort of bringing in expertise from an external provider to identify the best energy saving opportunities or some innovation. And then finally, sort of resource, particularly for public sector organisations, through the existence of frameworks and their associated sort of template documentation that helps, well, that aim to help anyway with procurement routes. So then if we look at performance guarantees on the next slide in a bit more detail. So Energy savings, or the energy saving guarantee, is usually defined as a sort of the minimum kilowatt hour or financial saving, and that's agreed against again a defined baseline with perhaps also defined conditions. So that might be external or internal operational conditions that are defined as part of the baseline. And that's all will be measured as part of an M&V process. So M&V meaning measurement and verification. And there will be a plan which, in sort of simple terms, defines the baseline and how that will be used to measure savings. So just if we look at performance guarantees on the next slide in more detail, in terms of what will typically happen, well, I suppose two possible outcomes. If the measured saving is lower than the guarantee, then some sort of compensation or requirement to improve. Or if the saving is higher than the guarantee, then there may be some benefit to the ESCO, say sort of a share of the savings, or it might be that savings are banked for a subsequent year of the contract. On the next slide, just a sort of brief bit of information about measurement and verification plans. I mean, we sort of do whole courses on this sort of thing, so this is really a very brief introduction. But most ESCOs, and by an ESCO I mean an energy services company, so use that term interchangeably with the energy performance contract project provider. So that's what I mean by an ESCO. And they will usually refer to the International Performance Measurement and Verification Protocol when they develop their plans. And that protocol is very widely used, and I guess was developed with performance contracts in mind. So they will develop an M&V plan according to that protocol, which is project specific and should take into account the technology types and the project type, and essentially make sure that risks of the measurement risks are transferred appropriately. So it's important to bear in mind that whilst it's usually the ESCO who develops the M&V plan, there will be some responsibilities for the end user in terms of agreeing the plan, and also sometimes providing some input and some information. So then if we look at the, I think on the next slide, a typical EPC timeline. So it may look something like this, starting with, I guess, the decision to try and identify a project, find the opportunity and the business case, and get management support, I suppose. Next, the procurement stage. So that will likely involve supplier selection, site visits and initial proposals. And then the contract population will follow that. So that will involve the sort of the development of the final technical proposal, which we often refer to as the investment grade audit. But it's very important, I suppose, at this point before the contract is closed, that the costs and the guaranteed savings are set out, that there's a measurement and verification plan in place, and contractual terms are agreed and finalised. So then following that, we have I guess the implementation of the project itself, and then finally the service period where the measures are perhaps maintained, optimized, maybe identify some other opportunities, and crucially some measurement and verification reporting to make sure that the savings are measured and verified and reconciled against the guarantee, and then until the contract ends. So then on the next slide, some indications of timescales. So up until the sort of steps involved in getting to the point of deciding to use an energy performance contract. So I guess in our experience of projects that are sort of between £1 and £5 million sort of type investment, this could be between sort of 6 to 8 months in total, and then the procurement phase probably sort of 4 to 6 months. Implementation, depending on the sort of the complexity and the nature of the ECMs, could be up to 6 months, and with perhaps some additional commissioning. And then finally, the sort of the guaranteed operation, 6 to 10 years is sort of fairly typical for the lengths of these sorts of projects, but that will depend on the contract duration. So moving on then to this sort of a bit of sort of market information. This data, so EEVS was the UK partner on a Horizon 2020 project called Quality, and that was a research project which was aiming to establish a set of quality criteria for energy services. And as part of that work, we did some market research into the European ESCO industry. So that's where the data from all of these charts come from. So a questionnaire of UK and European ESCOs. So firstly, we asked them, how much their projects were worth. And interesting to note that the UK in green here has quite a sort of a pronounced spike at the sort of 1 million to £5 million point, and that's perhaps driven by local authorities and university type projects, and a few in the higher bracket at 5 million plus, perhaps driven by NHS projects. But interesting to note that we have sort of that bigger point for the UK compared to the rest of Europe, perhaps indicating that the market in the UK is slightly more developed. And then in the next slide, I think we look at sort of common duration of energy performance contracts. So again, the sort of 5 to 10 years is the one that we do find most typical. In this case, we're actually much more similar to the rest of Europe. And then on the next slide, just thinking about where these markets, so these market values come from, and I guess mostly related to the project investment costs in terms of the type and the scope of the projects and the building types, and their existing condition, as well as the cost of energy and finance. So I suppose the smaller single technology type projects, so often see some that are particularly focusing on lighting, for example, tend to be the more simple in terms of deployment and specification, and have sort of paybacks at the lower end of the scale. Whereas something more comprehensive, perhaps involving sort of building fabric upgrades or combined heat and power, will be at the higher end and involve much greater investment. So then just looking at the EPC market in terms of who the people involved are. So clients, firstly, sort of owners and occupiers that use energy, typically public sector, NHS particularly, universities, local authorities, etc. But I guess organisations that have an appetite for a long-term contract because they're quite stable organisations. Then we have our EPC providers, ESCOs, typically technology suppliers or engineering companies, some facilities management, or perhaps even sort of specialist ESCOs. And they typically act as an umbrella organisation, bringing together several subcontractors, and they will also do sort of project management and some measurement verification themselves. And then we have financial institutions, so public or private finance that would supply either the ESCO or the client. And then finally are sort of consultants or project facilitators, so basically specialists in energy performance contracts that may support clients in project development or perhaps contract agreement and contract management. On the next slide, just a bit more information about where end users are. So end users of ESCOs, of ESCOs projects. The majority of clients in the UK are public sector, again, sort of driven by strong public sector procurement frameworks. You might note that the sum of these bars between them add up to more than 100%, but that's related to the fact that some of the respondents cross more than one sector. So that's why that is. And again, sort of we're reasonably similar to the rest of Europe. Again, a sort of a focus in the public sector there across Europe. And then I think on the next slide, sort of thinking about the interactions between the different parties. So the EPC provider acting as an umbrella organisation, procuring technologies and services from their subcontractors, and they're responsible for the provision of the service and the energy saving guarantee. The finance might feed into the EPC provider, or actually might also feed into the client. And then the facilitators will sort of, I guess, sit in the middle of these and sort of provide expertise into any of those parties. So actually a bit more detail on that on the next slide in terms of who and when. So perhaps at the sort of initial business case development point, and help with sort of getting management support, some benchmarking and preliminary analysis, identifying funding streams. And then in the procurement phase, often support is sought with sort of specification design and also legal heads of terms, tender design and evaluation. And then during the contract development phase, it's quite common to have sort of technical due diligence on the investment grade audit, but also on the measurement and verification proposals, and of course legal due diligence as well. During the implementation phase, then project management and sort of help with commissioning is often sought. And then finally, in the sort of guaranteed operation, again, contract management, project management, but also perhaps sort of general performance governance. So the whole piece around measuring the savings properly and the reconciliation and making sure that any sort of next steps are taken appropriately. And then just a couple of slides on where funding or typical sources of and options for funding. So a client might use their own capital or loan from their sort of existing lines of credit. So for example, sort of Salix in the public sector, or the ESCO might be able to provide capital or a loan, or perhaps some sort of leasing arrangement. And where there are leasing arrangements, they're sort of usually linked to the technology, so like CHP, possibly lighting, but basically where assets are in some way sort of removable or have a resale value, and they're sort of often accompanied by some sort of maintenance service. Or a third way of doing it, it would be to set up perhaps a special purpose vehicle for a project or many projects. So the SPV, the EPC provider is then delivering the service on behalf of the SPV, and the client pays service fees into the SPV. And there might be a large portfolio of projects in order for the ESCO to sort of spread the risk. And then we did ask our survey on the next slide, our ESCOs where their sources of where their clients got their funding from. Again, we can sort of see by this that the majority of EPCs funding funded by client internal funds, client debt, and perhaps more focus on client capital in the UK compared to the rest of Europe, which perhaps indicates that raising affordable finance is still something of a barrier for EPCs. So financing options are certainly out there, but perhaps they're considered too expensive. So one final slide from me before I hand over to Jez, and that was the sort of question of what makes for a good energy performance contract, what makes for a good EPC project, and it's a long-term partnership, so this is very important to consider. So thinking about the quality of the submission, the types of technologies, levels of service, etc., aligning with the organisation's objectives, good communication, incredibly important really at all points. So sort of well organised with regular meetings and clear reporting, and a good sort of governance structure to enable the right engagement with the right people, well-defined roles and responsibilities, I suppose. On-time delivery, of course, savings, there's a cost to savings if the project is delayed, but those savings need to be, in order to be achieved, need to be sort of realistic in the first place. So I think part of that is, being realistic with the investment grade audit, but also making sure that buildings are suitable in the first place. And then finally, sort of, being clear and transparent in reporting results and making sure that there's a clear framework for reconciliation. So I'll now hand over to Jez.
Okay, thank you very much. The only thing I'd add on to there, because this isn't really a sales type of webinar, of course, but from my perspective, it's very clear that independent measurement and verification of the overall EPC is vital, and of course that's a part that EEVS actually play. So yeah, it's just really important. So the EPCs might do the initial measurement and verification, but the customer needs to have ultimate control and verification themselves of that overall approach. So if we're going into sort of part two in terms of project setup, we've talked in part about project identification. So again, a personal view is that as long as it's planned properly, I think it's much more effective if the customer is identifying their own projects rather than having a blank sheet of paper and going out to for an energy performance contract sort of tender. So there is probably quite a lot of information within the end user, and they should ideally build on that. Some perhaps haven't got time because they actually want to go out to tender, but it's a much more effective approach for the end user to ultimately control the initial phase of pulling projects together, even though they then subsequently say to the EPC potential partners, these are some ideas, and the EPC partner themselves have to then validate and build up their own projects and ultimately own those projects, but it gives them a good head start. So establishing that the project is practical, as Hilary just mentioned, is critical, and there are various other items which I'll come to that are sort of part of the analysis shortly. In terms of the business case, well, there's two different stages potentially of business case. There's the business case to get buy-in to the process. And again, that's where having a suite of projects within the end user organization is, I'd say, essential, but certainly preferable. And in a way that can be irrespective of whether you end up going down the EPC route. But there's two elements in there that you need to do. One is to clearly identify the financial benefits, and there's some of those that are listed there. But also it's about identifying non-direct or non-energy financial benefits also as part of that initial business case. Later down the road, there's a more detailed business case once you've obviously got the tender responses from the various energy performance contracting companies. Then you need to do a more detailed business case to validate whether you're actually going to, well, you should have agreed in principle on the first business case that that's what you were going to do, and the rationale be clear. But at that second business case, you're actually almost pressing the green button and, if you like, beginning the negotiations. But just to reiterate, the non-energy financial benefits can be considerable. I mean, certainly from a JRP Solutions experience across the 21 years we've been operating, we keep a log, and we know that 30% of all savings actually have, I was going to say, nothing to do with energy. They are not energy cost related. They have a relationship to energy, of course, but things like maintenance, operation, efficiency, productivity, if it's especially in the industrial environment. So in terms of both types of business case, it's very important to draw all of these things together. You might have options for different types of funding as you go into the process. So you don't necessarily need to have excluded or determined exactly what you're doing. You do by the time you get to the second business case. And you probably ought to be considering what type of financial model you're going to be using for your own evaluation. So simple payback has its place, but it's not necessarily the best way to look at projects. other considerations could be in terms of increasing known or estimated increases in energy prices. But certainly, before I come on to that, the type of financial appraisal type approach, whether it's LCCA, net present value, internal rate of return, is definitely worth documenting, and indeed you may use different approaches for different types of project. What are these other aspects that you would want to be considering in your total savings and ultimately that's strength within the business case? I'm not going to read down these slides, you can look at those, but my ultimate takeout is that these can be quite significant, and therefore there's a danger in ignoring them. And they are real, so therefore they should be part of the business case, and they ought really to be part of how it is looked at in the very first instance. And another aspect to consider is the sensitivity analysis. Whilst you might have a prediction based upon your different projects, clearly there is going to be potential change, and those changes could be a number, such as those listed there. If it's items like production variations, floor area, degree days, then they can be accommodated and need to be accommodated over the term of the contract if they are going to have an impact. And this again is where it comes back very much to the IP MVP, measurement and verification approach, and having set out the stall as to how you're going to measure the project in years to come right at the beginning. So you're already outlining how you're going to measure the success. And without that, you're going to have significant problems. And some of those others there are things to consider. And if you want to see what the sensitivity is, then you have to do it and plot some of the potential variations that you perceive in the future, such that you can realize and make sure you've got the best approach to the contractual approach and how you're going to measure it. So what should go into an executive summary? Perhaps some of these things are fairly obvious. So I'm not going to read down them, but please do have a look. And my biggest one on there that I would just build on a little bit is that it should be short, which is the sort of bottom middle. So executive summary part of the business case is very important. If it can be done graphically, so much the better. Sensitivity analysis graphically is a good inclusion, because ultimately that is an element of risk that you need to be considered and would be considered at the highest level before proceeding. So in terms of part 3, the sort of technical specification. So I've highlighted that ideally the end user organization would be realizing the projects, and this is explaining how they or an EPC should be determined the methodology that they actually use, such as the standard that's outlined there, or actually there's more clarity now in ISO 50001 as well. So the customer might do, the end user organization might do an IEA, an initial energy assessment. They could indeed do an IGA, the investment grade audit as well, but that's obviously for them to determine. But how would someone do that, and what are the things that you should define as a requirement for the EPC contractor to actually look at? And so some of these, again, might be fairly straightforward. You might see such content in an ESOS report, for example, but often they don't go to the next levels, which definitely you require as part of looking at an EPC. So you can see in there the sensitivity analysis. This is sort of page 1 of 2 of this particular table, which I've kept very simple, but I'm just trying to outline the principles of the different types of areas that should be kept. You'll see that there's other non-energy costs included in a standard form of document. And other things are also very important to determine, and I've picked out just 3 of those there. One is the accuracy of the savings. So the savings might have variances on them. The capital costs might have variances on them. They might be in a range. So it's important to take from the individual projects, which is what this is, and build up a picture for all of the projects using this sort of information. And finally, of the 3 on there, to look at the risk, and to use, that's a simple 3 by 3, but you could use any 5 by 5 or some sort of criteria that's a customer defined process, probably, to determine the risk and to also factor that into the business case. Because if you don't look at the risks at this stage, you're potentially asking for problems later. So if it's been carefully detailed as an IGA, then the next thing, which kind of comes into the risks that we just talked about, is the assumptions, because those assumptions will actually ultimately lead to the risk score, or in part, and the same with any uncertainties. Also, I would again stress that one of the most common problem areas is not stipulating condition standards. So light level, temperature, humidity, because you need to be able to compare your energy savings against a known standard condition. It's all very well and good saving energy if you're providing half the light level that you actually require. But equally, the reverse happens. You know, you want to be able to verify that the light level, for example, isn't exceeded. So all of these being defined in a contractual arrangement is very important. And they will, if they're not, they will have deviations that will be detrimental to the viability of a EPC. So, just before I do pass over to Lev, one thing that I haven't mentioned so far and no one's mentioned it so far, is behavior change. So behavior change is a project and can be validated just the same as a technical project, and it shouldn't be forgotten in the whole equation. Whether there's an energy management team from the energy performance contracting company, or some means of sharing the benefits from a behavior change project, it's also very good at pulling together all of the elements of energy and an energy performance contract to get a holistic response, and to take benefits of the significant opportunities from behavior change. So that should be treated as a independent single project, or certainly by building. Okay, I'm now going to pass over to Lev.
Hello, good morning, everybody, and thank you, Jez. Just a brief introduction. My name is Levent Gurdenli. I'm a renewable energy and sustainability partner at the law firm Weightmans. And Weightmans, we've got 8 offices across the United Kingdom, and a really excellent renewable energy and energy management team. We advise and got lots of experience advising public sector and private sector clients in connection with all sorts of renewables or energy management projects, be that EPC contracting, on-site generation, corporate PPAs, and kind of energy as a service type deals as well. So I am here to talk to you about some of the legal aspects and legal considerations that you should take into account when you're embarking upon your EPC contracting journey. So the first thing I would say is, just before you start, take a step back and take a very holistic view at the entirety of the project. And so what I mean by that is that the legal risks associated with a fairly straightforward lighting project are obviously going to be very different to a project which has multiple kind of interventions across a portfolio of different sites. Likewise, the risk profile for a hospital is going to be rather different to that of a school or a manufacturing client, for example, as well. So clearly, the approach has to be tailored in each case appropriately. Then the other thing I would say in terms of taking a holistic view is just thinking about the fact that the legal agreements, the EPC contract, has to interface with all other aspects of the project, which Jez and Hilary have been outlining, and cannot be siloed. So there has to be a sufficiently good link and interface to the various, to the IGAs, the investment grade audits, the M&V plans, potentially with existing FM contracts. And there may also be separate kind of construction agreements as well that need to be entered into, and everything needs to link together. Finally, in terms of this kind of holistic process, or looking at the process, I'd also just urge you to make sure you don't overlook and include the legals as part of the procurement process when you are selecting an ESCO, and not just to focus on some of the technical and commercial considerations. So, for example, you could ask bidders to mark up and respond to a detailed heads of terms that's issued at the same time as everything else. And the reason for this is that it does really go to the quality of their offer. A large, shiny, guaranteed savings figure might look great on the face of it, but could mean a lot less if it's actually subject to 10 different assumptions, or the ESCO isn't willing to take certain risks, or it's capping its liability in lots of different areas. And it's a really good idea to confront these issues and face them kind of really early on in the process, rather than finding out about them just as you want to get to signing agreements and get going on your project, which could lead to a bit of a significant delay. Next slide, please, Jez. The next thing we wanted to do was just look at a couple of high-level structures here of EPC contracts, which are effectively driven by how a project is funded, and take a very quick look at kind of the four, I'd say, key commercial risks here. So performance, price risk, funding, and also a balance sheet treatment as well. So looking at kind of performance risk first. So on the left of the slide, you can see a structure of a client funded project. And in this case, it's the client funding this through taking out a loan. In this instance, because the client is funding the project, it's very common, and it's able to impose a savings guarantee to be on the ESCO. And that guarantee provided by the ESCO has to be sized to cover any loan repayments that the client has to make, and any fee for services that it provides to the ESCO as well. And so to the extent, obviously, that the savings achieved do not meet whatever the guaranteed levels are, the ESCO then has to make the client whole through some kind of payment. On the other side of the slide is an ESCO funded model. where the ESCO is funding the project, the capex for the project, and again assuming here through some kind of third-party funder here. In this instance, because the ESCO is funding it, you're not so likely to have a guaranteed savings model, or if you do, the guarantee would be subject to a much lower floor than where the client is funding it. Instead, what you see is a shared savings model where an ESCO effectively retains a share of the savings which are generated, and the percentage of that share will obviously be negotiated on a case-by-case basis. And in this instance, from the ESCO's perspective, the share of those savings must be sufficient to cover any repayments that it has to make to its funder or lender. But even though there are kind of slight differences there, in both cases, you can see that the payment to ESCO is contingent upon achieving savings. And so we can say that the performance risk does sit with the ESCO in all instances there. In terms of price risk, and by that I mean the risk of utility costs or prices going up or down across the duration of the project. In both these instances, it's very unlikely that the ESCO would ever accept to take on that price risk, because it's just too volatile. And instead, the EPC contract will be linked to deemed rates, which are effectively set and hardwired into the contract at the outset. And so any measurement in the future is by reference to what those prices are, as opposed to, as I say, what the market might actually be on the day in question. And it's just worth remembering here as well that in your sell of these sorts of projects to finance colleagues, perhaps, remember, utility costs obviously could increase after you've entered into an EPC contract. So your overall utility costs might actually increase after a few years, which might on the face of it seem odd if you're entering into one of these arrangements. But just remember, obviously, if you hadn't, the key point is that your costs would be even higher than they are. So a saving clearly has been generated. In terms of then funding and looking at the funder side of things there, effectively across the two models there, if you do have a funder, then they are exposed to different counterparty risks here, and so you will see some differences there in terms of approach. In particular, where you look at a shared savings models there, you might, especially if it's as Hilary was talking about SPVs earlier, done on a project finance type basis, you might see lenders asking the ESCOs to procure some kind of independent security from clients to mitigate against the risk of non-payment. There may also be some significant termination liabilities, early termination liabilities, which we'll get onto later. And again, if it is some kind of like project finance type solution, then the lender is also likely to want to take security over assets, over the various assets in question, and might also require to enter into direct kind of step-in arrangements or agreements with the client as well. Lastly, on this, just looking at or considering balance sheet treatment, and if balance sheet treatment is important to you, it does depend on the client in question. There are ways of structuring these deals on an off balance sheet basis. There's not necessarily a one size fits all approach to this. And the extent to something will be treated as off balance sheet will effectively depend on the degree of control over the assets in question that the ESCO has, and also the extent to which the ESCO derives significant economic benefit from the assets in question. So, for example, if you're looking at a CHP type project, if an ESCO has a lease of a certain area, has exclusive possession of that area where the plant and equipment is, does absolutely all of the operation and maintenance of that equipment, and then under a shared savings model retains 80 to 90% of savings which are generated, you can make a good case for that being off balance sheet. However, compare that against let's say a relatively straightforward lighting project, perhaps still funded by the ESCO, but where obviously it won't have any kind of lease, or any kind of exclusive possession, it probably won't be operating or maintaining or replacing any of the lighting in question at all either. That starts to look a little bit different, and perhaps more like some kind of asset leasing type arrangement. I've actually, even worked on projects, lighting project, in fact, which, in an attempt to try and get around this, the ESCO installed what they described as a kill switch to enable it to switch off all of the lights in cases of default, to demonstrate that it still did retain control over all of the assets. But clearly that may or may not be appropriate in all, depending on where those lights are actually to be installed and the site in question. But yeah, it does go to show some of the stuff you need to think about. Next slide, please, Jez. Thank you. Kind of like the final slide I'm going to speak to, I just thought I'd look as well at some of the other kind of key legal and commercial issues for a project, and just going through the different kind of phases that we've already been through with Jez and Hilary. So looking at the kind of the project setup stage, procurement is the first on the list there. Depending on obviously your organization, you may or may not be subject to the public procurement regulation. So the first thing I would say is that clearly any process you run must be compliant with that, and you must have a view to that. And as Hilary mentioned, there are frameworks available to the public sector which can absolutely help with this and guide you through it and make it a lot easier. As I said before, one thing I would absolutely urge is to not forget the legals in that process. I've already been through balance sheet treatment and, as I say, the kind of the funding risks, so shan't repeat those there. But in terms of then the other thing on the slide there, baseline assumptions, it's really kind of any measurement of savings in the contract or any guarantee that you have is obviously going to link to this. So first of all, it's really critical that your contract doesn't say something different to what's in your MV plan or the IGA investment grade audits. They've got to be, or they should be speaking the same language effectively, and no conflict between them. In terms of those then assumptions and things like that in the audits and the MV plan, it's critical, obviously, critical that those are correct, but that they also set out in sufficient detail such that when it comes to the end of the relevant period, there really shouldn't be any scope to dispute the outcome, or the scope should be minimized as far as possible, because that's really where you get into trouble a lot of times in these sorts of agreements, is where there are inconsistencies, and it does lead to that kind of confusion and dispute. Another thing that's not listed, which I will mention on the project setup stage, is kind of consents and getting due diligence done early in respect of your particular site, because again, depending on where it's located or what it is and what you're doing, you may require consents from, let's say, a superior landlord to install plant and equipment, and clearly an ESCO isn't going to be willing to take any kind of that sort of risk on, or the risk of a landlord suddenly popping up and asking for an injunction and asking for them to cease and desist installing equipment and removing them and restoring the site to what it was. So yeah, make sure that's done early on and taken into account at the project setup phase. Moving then to the kind of the construction phase, kind of potentially the riskiest part of this for any client. And what we're looking at there is in terms of business interruption or operational interruption, property damage and consequential losses. What happens, or the risk of the ESCO causing, let's say, a power outage, which then obviously impacts on your production. Delays to the works, which then affects your operations. The fact as well that there will be general inconvenience as a result of these works. What can we do here? I think one thing to say is that in terms of these risks, the ESCO is unlikely to take on liability for losses of profit losses of revenue in these sorts of arrangements. And in an ESCO funded project, they're unlikely to, or they'll be very reticent to take on liability for things like delay, liquidated damages as well, in cases of delay, like you'd see in a usual kind of construction arrangement. So with that in mind, what are the best kind of ways of dealing with that? And I think, from a contractual perspective, it's just making sure that there are robust kind of access provisions, access protocols, clear windows for where it's to be carried out, and just really solid kind of project management really is the best way to get around that. There's also obviously the fact that you could have insurance products available and insurance to be taken out to mitigate, to get some of these risks, such as business interruption insurance, and performance security as well. It might be appropriate to ask the ESCO to provide some kind of independent kind of performance security to cover some of the losses that could be incurred as a result of their activities, which is again fairly common in kind of standard construction arrangements. Moving then on to the kind of operational phase and some of the key points there. Again, covered price risk before and looked at kind of savings already. So again, shan't go over those. So the other kind of three I mentioned are, number one, another interface point. But you're likely to have at the site probably some form of facilities management with an FM provider responsible for certain assets. So there's the potential for what the ESCO does and what they do to overlap. So it's really important to define really carefully what is within the ESCO's scope and what is outside of that, and within the FM provider's scope. And it's important because clearly an ESCO is going to want relief from any of its obligations or liabilities to the extent that's been caused by a third party, and vice versa. So in addition to kind of defining that scope, you might need to look at, review and amend existing FM agreements that are in place. The last one I mentioned now, just because we're running short of time, is on kind of the early termination and treatment of assets. This is especially a risk in the context of ESCO funded projects, where an ESCO has made a significant capex or potentially very significant capex investment, and in fairness could stand to incur a significant loss if the agreement, the EPC contract, is terminated early, particularly if it's terminated early on in its term. So in cases of a client default, it needs to recover and will want to recover its capex. Obviously, it's got its own loan repayments to make. Plus, it will be looking to recover losses of kind of future profit that it stood to make from the agreement itself. But even in the case of ESCO default as well, you can have a similar scenario where it's going to still want to recover its capex, or need to potentially recover its capex and cover off its funding requirements and liabilities, and particularly in the cases where a client retains assets in question, because in that scenario, the client will be obviously retaining assets and potentially keeping them almost for free. So there's likely to be some kind of termination payment going towards the ESCO in that scenario as well. And I'd just like to say, that ESCOs are going to want to have fairly significant and robust protection to enforce that sort of liability. And so you could see them asking for security in respect to those termination payments. And it's also where leases are quite useful for an ESCO, because effectively that always provides potentially with a worst case scenario of being able to recover assets in cases of insolvency, for example. I will wrap it up there and hand it back now just to Jez to do a very short summary and conclusion before we call time. I won't go through these. These is just a checklist there of some of the key points to consider in the contract. And on the next slide is a kind of typical or indicative, but by no means exhaustive risk matrix as well. And Jez.
Thank you very much, Lev. We've had, just before we summarise, we've had one question from Joss Mister, which I think was covered at the beginning, but Hilary, you might want to just briefly answer, is about how common EPCs are in the UK. There was actually a slide showing the number of EPC contracts, but while we're waiting for Hilary, if she can come on, in essence, yes, it's quite common in the UK, more common in the UK certainly than the rest of Europe. I mean, as an organisation at the moment, we're dealing with quite a few at any one time. Hilary, do you want to just add?
Yeah, I mean, just to say that it's been particularly common as a procurement route in the public sector through the existence of, say, that like the refit framework, CEF and Essentia in the NHS. We certainly see in the I guess like maybe not quite hundreds of projects, but certainly tens of projects through those frameworks. So yeah, certainly very common in the public sector, less so in the private sector. Perhaps they're more like large organisations, fewer numbers, but like bigger projects in terms of the total value.
So in terms of thank you. In terms of a summary, yes, hopefully you've had chance now to read some of those sort of summary slides and comments on there. But certainly, I mean, we're here and available. We work together. We don't actually overlap each other's capabilities. And the other thing that I would mention is that we also have this is a derivative of what is actually a whole day course with an interactive session, which due to COVID, we've wanted to sort of keep up the information gathering, but hopefully in the spring of next year, we'll be able to revert back to whole day sessions to which everyone, of course, would be invited. So any other concluding comments, Hilary or Lev?
I suppose from my point of view, I think one of the most important things is to make sure that the contract, the investment grade audit, and the M&V plan are all sort of considered as a suite of documents that reference each other and make sense in the context of the other documents, and also to make sure that they're finalised and agreed before any works actually start, which perhaps sounds like an obvious thing, but is a key issue, that they're not actually properly finished before the project goes ahead.
Indeed.
I would absolutely echo that. And the only other point I'd make is, yes, just not ignoring, as I said, some of those key kind of legal points from the outset, and really establishing and pinning down what it is that the ESCO is willing to provide, what it's subject to, and as I say, making sure that doesn't come up as a surprise at the 11th hour, just as you want to sign something.
So I think we've got 1 minute left for any other questions. If anyone has any, please put them into the Q&A or via chat. Oh, I see we've had one pop in. Oh, thank you. That's great. Glad you found it useful, Joss. Any other questions? If not, thank you very much for listening. You know how to contact us if you need any help. We're very happy to help, because this is a ever increasing and growing area of moving towards net zero. Okay, thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Goodbye.